The desert sun beat down merciless and unforgiving on Quinton Quade's weathered face as his horse stumbled over something half buried in the sand. And when he dismounted to check what had spooked the animal, he found a leather satchel containing a letter that would unravel everything he thought he knew about love and redemption. It was late August in 1878, and Quinton had been riding through the scorching California desert for 3 days straight, heading back to Redding after delivering a herd of cattle to a ranch near Sacramento. The journey had left him bone-tired and sun-scorched, his canteen nearly empty and his patience worn thin. At 26 years old, he had spent the better part of his adult life as a ranch hand and occasional cattle driver, a solitary existence that suited him just fine after the war had taken his family and left him with nothing but bitter memories. The satchel was partially concealed beneath a layer of sand and scrub brush, its leather dried and cracked from exposure to the elements. Quinton knelt down, brushing away the debris with calloused hands, wondering what kind of fool would leave their belongings out here in the middle of nowhere. As he opened the bag, he found a few scattered belongings. A small silver locket, a faded photograph of a young woman with kind eyes, and a sealed envelope addressed to no one in particular. His fingers trembled slightly as he broke the wax seal, something inside him recognizing that this moment mattered somehow, though he could not have said why. The letter was written in elegant script, the ink faded but still legible, and as he began to read, the words reached into his chest and squeezed his heart with an intensity that took his breath away. To whoever finds this letter, I write these words in the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, might understand the depth of love that exists in this world, even when all seems lost. My name is Liliana Morrison, and I am 23 years old. By the time you read this, I may already be gone, taken by the desert or by those who pursue me. I fled my home in Redding 3 weeks ago to escape a marriage arranged by my father to a cruel man named Bernard Whitmore, a wealthy landowner who saw me as nothing more than property to be acquired. I could not bear the thought of spending my life with a man who had no kindness in his heart, so I ran, taking only what I could carry and praying that I might find freedom somewhere beyond the horizon. But the desert is vast and unforgiving, and I fear I have made a terrible mistake. My supplies are nearly gone, my strength is failing, and I do not know if I will survive another day. Yet even now, facing what may be my final hours, I do not regret my choice. I would rather die free than live in captivity, even a gilded one. If you are reading this, please know that love matters more than anything else in this world. Do not waste your life settling for less than what your heart truly desires. Do not let fear or duty or obligation steal away the precious years you have been given. Love fiercely, love truly, and never let go of those who matter most. And if by some miracle I have survived and you have found me, please help me. I am heading toward the mountains to the north, hoping to find sanctuary in one of the mining camps where I might disappear and start a new life. I have no money to offer you, no reward except my eternal gratitude and the knowledge that you have saved a life that desperately wanted to be lived. Please, if there is any kindness in your heart, find me. With hope and desperation, Liliana Morrison Quinton read the letter 3 times, his mind racing with possibilities and questions. The handwriting was shaky in places, suggesting it had been written under duress or in poor conditions. The date at the top indicated it had been penned just 5 days ago, which meant that if this Liliana Morrison was still alive, she could not have gotten far on foot in this brutal landscape. He looked around at the endless expanse of sand and rock stretching in every direction, then up at the mountains rising in the distance to the north. Every practical instinct told him to continue on his way back to Reading, to mind his own business and let fate take its course. He had his own troubles to worry about, his own demons to wrestle with. What was one more lost soul in a world full of suffering and hardship? But something about those words, that desperate plea for help and that fierce declaration of independence, stirred something long dormant in his chest. He thought about his own sister, Sarah, who had died during the war when Confederate raiders had burned their family farm. She had been just 20 years old, full of life and dreams that would never be realized. What if someone could have saved her? What if a stranger had found her in her moment of greatest need and chosen to help? Quinton carefully folded the letter and placed it in his shirt pocket, close to his heart. He remounted his horse and turned the animal's head toward the northern mountains, his jaw set with determination. He would find Liliana Morrison, if she still lived, and he would help her reach safety. It was the right thing to do, the only thing to do, even if it meant delaying his return home and venturing into dangerous territory. The rest of that day passed in a blur of heat and dust as he pushed his horse harder than he should have, scanning the landscape for any sign of human passage. The desert revealed its secrets reluctantly, but Quinton had spent enough years tracking cattle and wild game to know what to look for. A disturbed patch of sand here, a footprint barely visible there, the scattered remains of a small fire that had been hastily extinguished. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and crimson, Quinton spotted something that made his heart leap with hope and dread. A dark shape lay crumpled beneath a rocky outcropping about 100 yards ahead, too small to be an animal, too still to be anything but trouble. He spurred his horse forward and dismounted in a rush, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust as he ran toward the figure. It was a woman, her clothes torn and dusty, her face partially hidden by tangled dark hair. She lay on her side in a position that suggested she had simply collapsed where she stood, too exhausted to take another step. "Miss Morrison," Quinton called out, his voice rough from days of silence. "Liliana Morrison." There was no response, no movement at all, and for a terrible moment he thought he had arrived too late. But then he saw the faint rise and fall of her chest, the slight flutter of her eyelids, and relief flooded through him with such force that his knees nearly buckled. He knelt beside her and gently turned her onto her back, brushing the hair from her face with careful fingers. She was young, probably around the age mentioned in the letter, with delicate features that were now sunburned and cracked from exposure. Her lips were dry and bleeding, her breathing shallow and labored. Dehydration, heat exhaustion, possibly worse. Quinton grabbed his canteen and carefully tilted a few drops of water onto her lips. "Come on now," he murmured, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You did not come all this way just to give up now." The water seemed to rouse her slightly, and her eyelids fluttered open to reveal eyes the color of dark honey, glazed with fever and confusion. She tried to speak, but could only manage a hoarse whisper that he could not make out. "Save your strength," he told her, offering her another small sip of water. "I found your letter. I am here to help you." Something like hope flickered in those fevered eyes before they closed again, and she went limp in his arms. Quinton wasted no time in assessing the situation. The sun would be down within the hour, and the desert temperature would drop rapidly once darkness fell. She needed shelter, water, proper care, none of which he could provide adequately out here in the open. The nearest town was a small settlement called Shasta City, about 15 miles to the west. It was too far to travel in the dark with an unconscious woman, but there was an old prospector's cabin he remembered seeing a few years back, maybe 5 miles north of their current position. It had been abandoned when the gold ran out, but the structure had still been standing the last time he had passed through this area. It would have to do. Quinton carefully lifted Liliana into his arms, struck by how light she felt, how fragile. She had lost weight during her ordeal in the desert, her body consuming itself in the struggle to survive. He settled her as gently as possible on his horse, then climbed up behind her, cradling her against his chest to keep her from falling. The ride to the cabin seemed to take forever, the horse moving carefully over the rocky terrain as the sun disappeared, and the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Quinton found himself talking to the unconscious woman, though he could not have said why. He told her about the cabin, about his plans to get her to safety, about how stubborn she must be to have survived this long on her own. "You are tougher than you look," he said softly, his breath stirring the hair at her temple. "Most people would have died out here days ago. But you kept going, did you not? You kept fighting." When they finally reached the cabin, it was full dark, the only light coming from the moon and stars overhead. The structure was still standing, though it had seen better days. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and several of the window panes were broken, but the roof appeared intact, and the inside was blessedly free of dangerous wildlife. Quinton dismounted and carefully lowered Liliana to the ground, then quickly set about making the cabin habitable. He found some old blankets in a trunk that smelled musty but were still serviceable, and he fashioned a makeshift bed in the corner farthest from the broken windows. There was even some firewood stacked near the old fireplace, dried out from years of sitting but still burnable. Within an hour, he had a fire going, providing both warmth and light. He settled Liliana on the blankets and began the careful process of treating her injuries and ailments. He had learned basic medicine during the war, enough to know that dehydration and heat exhaustion were serious conditions that required careful management. Too much water too quickly could be as dangerous as none at all. He gave her small sips every few minutes, monitoring her breathing and pulse, wiping her face and arms with a damp cloth to help bring down her fever. As he worked, he found himself studying her features in the firelight, noting the determination that lingered even in unconsciousness, the strong line of her jaw, the stubborn set to her mouth even in sleep. "Who are you really, Liliana Morrison?" he wondered aloud. "What kind of woman risks everything for freedom?" The night wore on slowly, punctuated by Quinton's regular checks on his patient and periodic trips outside to tend to his horse. He found himself unable to sleep, afraid that if he closed his eyes for even a moment, she might take a turn for the worse, and he would not be there to help her. It was near dawn when she finally stirred, her eyes opening slowly to take in the unfamiliar surroundings. Quinton was sitting nearby, feeding the fire, and he turned at the sound of her movement. "Easy now," he said, moving to kneel beside her. "You are safe. You are in an old cabin about 5 miles north of where I found you." Liliana's eyes found his face, and he saw recognition and wariness there in equal measure. "You found my letter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but stronger than it had been the night before. "I did," Quinton confirmed, offering her the canteen. "Drink slowly. You have been through quite an ordeal." She took a small sip, then another, her eyes never leaving his face. "Why did you come for me? You could have just kept riding." "I could have," he acknowledged, settling back on his heels. "But I did not. The name is Quinton Quade. I work ranches around Redding mostly, though I go where the work takes me." Her eyes widened slightly at the mention of Redding. "That is where I am from. Did you know my father, Abraham Morrison?" Quinton shook his head. "Cannot say that I do. I tend to keep to myself, do not mix much with the town folk beyond what is necessary for work." Liliana seemed to relax slightly at this information. Then you do not know Bernard Whitmore either. The man you were running from, Quinton said, remembering the name from her letter. No, I do not know him, but I gather he is not someone you want finding you. He is cruel, Liliana said, her voice hardening. He beat his first wife so badly that she lost their child and never recovered. She died 2 years ago, and everyone whispered that it was a blessing she was finally free of him. But my father only saw his wealth, his land, his standing in the community. He arranged the marriage without asking me, told me it was my duty to secure our family's future. So you ran, Quinton said simply. So I ran, she confirmed, a fierce pride lighting her eyes despite her weakened state. I would rather die free than live as that man's property. I know it was foolish, I know I was not prepared for the desert, but I had to try. I had to. Quinton found himself admiring her courage even as he recognized the recklessness of her actions. You almost did die. Another day out there and I would have found nothing but bones. But you did find me, Liliana said, reaching out to touch his hand with her own. The gesture was brief but sincere, and Quinton felt something shift in his chest at the contact. You saved my life. I will never be able to repay that debt. I do not want repayment, Quinton said gruffly, uncomfortable with her gratitude. I did what anyone decent would have done. No, Liliana said firmly. Most men would have kept riding. Most men would have minded their own business. But you came after me, you found me, you saved me. That means something. They fell into silence then, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the whisper of wind through the broken windows. Quinton found himself at a loss for words, unused to such directness, such honest emotion. He had spent so many years building walls around his heart, keeping everyone at a distance, that he did not know how to respond to this young woman's fierce gratitude. You should rest more, he finally said, retreating to the familiar ground of practical concerns. You are still weak. We will stay here another day or two until you are strong enough to travel, then I will take you to Shasta City. From there, you can decide what you want to do next. Liliana nodded slowly, her eyes already growing heavy again. Thank you, Quinton Quade. Thank you for giving me a chance at the life I dreamed of. As she drifted back to sleep, Quinton sat by the fire and stared into the flames, his mind churning with thoughts and questions he had no answers for. He had expected to find a desperate woman in need of rescue, and he had found that. But he had not expected to feel this strange pull, this unfamiliar stirring of something that felt dangerously close to caring. He had sworn off love and attachment after the war, after watching everyone he cared about die or disappear. It was easier that way, safer. But now, looking at Liliana's sleeping form in the firelight, he wondered if he had been running from life just as surely as she had been running toward it. The next 2 days passed in a strange kind of intimacy, as Quinton cared for Liliana, and she slowly regained her strength. They talked during the long hours, sharing stories and secrets in a way that felt both natural and terrifying to Quinton. He learned that she had grown up loving books and learning, that her mother had died when she was young, and her father had never quite recovered from the loss. She had dreams of becoming a teacher someday, of opening a school for girls in one of the mining towns where education was scarce. In turn, he told her about his own past, the words coming easier than he expected. He spoke of his family's farm in Missouri, of how the war had torn everything apart, of the long years since then spent drifting from one job to another with no real purpose or direction. You have been running too, Liliana observed on the second evening as they sat by the fire sharing a simple meal of beans and hardtack, just in a different way than I was. Quinton could not deny it. Maybe so. After you lose everything, it gets hard to see a reason to settle down anywhere. Easier to keep moving, keep working, not think too hard about what might have been. But is it really easier? Liliana asked gently. Or is it just another kind of prison? The question struck him harder than he wanted to admit. He looked at this young woman who had risked everything for freedom, who had nearly died rather than accept a life she did not want, and he felt ashamed of his own cowardice. She had fought for the life she wanted, while he had simply given up on wanting anything at all. "I do not know," he admitted finally. "I have been living this way for so long I do not remember what it feels like to want something different." Liliana reached across the small space between them and took his hand in hers. Her grip was stronger now, her skin less fevered, and he felt the warmth of her touch all the way to his bones. "Maybe it is time to remember," she said softly. "Maybe it is time for both of us to start living instead of just surviving." That night, as Quinton lay awake on the hard floor keeping watch while Liliana slept, he thought about her words and found himself wanting things he had not allowed himself to want in years. He wanted a home, a purpose, someone to share the burden and the beauty of life with. And more specifically, more dangerously, he found himself wanting to know this remarkable woman better, to be part of whatever life she built for herself beyond this cabin and this desperate flight. On the third day, Liliana was strong enough to walk around the cabin without assistance, and they both knew it was time to move on. Quinton had been stretching their meager supplies as far as they would go, but they could not stay hidden away forever. They needed to reach civilization, to get Liliana to safety and figure out what came next. They set out for Shasta City just after dawn, Liliana riding behind Quinton on his horse, her arms wrapped around his waist for balance. The contact felt both natural and charged with possibility, and Quinton found himself hyper-aware of every point where their bodies touched. The ride took most of the day, as they moved carefully through the difficult terrain. They talked less than they had in the cabin, both lost in their own thoughts about the future. As they crested a ridge overlooking Shasta City in the late afternoon sun, Liliana tightened her grip around Quinton's waist. "What if they find me?" she asked quietly. "What if my father has sent men looking for me, or worse, what if Bernard has come after me himself?" "Then we will deal with it," Quinton said with more confidence than he felt. "But we need supplies and proper rest before we can make any long-term plans." Shasta City is small enough that strangers are noticed, but big enough that we should be able to keep a low profile for a few days. They rode into town as the shadows were lengthening, drawing a few curious glances but nothing more. Quinton found a small boarding house on the edge of town, run by a tired-looking woman who asked no questions when he paid for 2 rooms with the last of his cash. "We will rest tonight," he told Liliana as they stood in the narrow hallway between their respective doors. "Tomorrow we will figure out what to do next." Liliana nodded, but she looked worried, the weight of her situation settling back onto her shoulders now that the immediate crisis had passed. "Quinton, I have no money, no skills that anyone would pay for, nowhere to go. I do not know how to thank you for everything you have done, but I cannot ask you to keep taking care of me. You have your own life to get back to. What if I do not want to go back to that life?" The words were out before Quinton could stop them, raw and honest and terrifying. "What if I want to help you build something new instead?" Liliana stared at him, her eyes wide with surprise and something else, something warm and hopeful that made his heart race. "You barely know me. Why would you tie yourself to my problems?" "Maybe because for the first time in 10 years, I feel like I have a reason to stop running," Quinton said, stepping closer to her. "Maybe because when I read your letter, something in me recognized something in you. You were willing to risk everything for freedom, for the chance to live life on your own terms. That takes a kind of courage I have not seen in a long time, and maybe I want to see where that courage takes you, takes us. Us, Liliana repeated softly, testing the word. I like the sound of that. They stood there in the hallway for a long moment, the air between them crackling with possibility and unspoken feelings. Then Liliana rose up on her toes and pressed a gentle kiss to Quinton's cheek. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. For seeing me, for saving me, for wanting to be part of whatever comes next." She slipped into her room before he could respond, leaving Quinton standing in the hallway with his heart pounding and his mind racing. He had not expected this, had not planned for it, but somewhere in the desert between finding her letter and bringing her to safety, he had started to fall for Liliana Morrison. And judging by that kiss, by the warmth in her eyes, she might be falling for him too. The next morning brought trouble in the form of two men asking questions around town about a missing woman from Reading. Quinton heard about it from the boarding house owner when he came down for breakfast, and his blood ran cold. "Said they were looking for a girl who ran away from home," the woman said, her eyes shrewd and knowing. Described her as about 23, dark hair, traveling alone. Said her father was worried sick and there was a reward for information leading to her safe return. "Did you tell them anything?" Quinton asked carefully. The woman shrugged. "Told them I had not seen anyone matching that description. I do not much care for men who chase down women who do not want to be found. Saw too much of that in my own life to want to help them along." Relief flooded through Quinton. "Thank you, that means more than you know. She is in trouble, your girl?" the woman asked bluntly. "She is not my girl," Quinton said automatically, then reconsidered. "Or maybe she is. And yes, she is in trouble. She ran from a marriage she did not want, and the men looking for her are not going to give up easy." The woman nodded slowly. "Then you best get her out of town before they come back this way. They are checking every establishment, every ranch, every place she might have stopped. It is only a matter of time before they work their way over here." Quinton thanked her and went to wake Liliana, his mind already working through their options. They could not stay in Shasta City, that much was clear. But where could they go that would be safe? Where could Liliana disappear and start the new life she wanted? When he knocked on her door and told her about the men, Liliana went pale but did not panic. "I knew they would come," she said quietly. "My father is nothing if not persistent, and Bernard does not like being denied what he thinks he owns." "We need to leave town," Quinton said. "Today, now if possible. Do you have any ideas about where you might want to go?" Liliana thought for a moment, then her face brightened slightly. "I have a cousin in Portland, Oregon. We were close as children, though I have not seen her in years. Her husband works in shipping and they have done well for themselves. If I could get there, I think they would take me in, help me get established." "Portland is a long way from here," Quinton said, already calculating the distance and the difficulties. "But it might be far enough to throw them off your trail. And Oregon is far enough from California that even if they suspected, it would be hard for them to pursue." "You do not have to come with me," Liliana said, though her eyes pleaded otherwise. "You have already done so much. I cannot ask you to leave everything behind and travel hundreds of miles for someone you barely know." Quinton reached out and took her hands in his, struck by how right it felt to touch her, to be near her. "What if you are not asking? What if I am offering? Liliana, I meant what I said last night. For the first time in a very long time, I feel like I have a purpose, a direction. I want to help you get to Portland. I want to make sure you are safe. And after that, well, we can figure out what comes next when we get there." Tears welled up in Liliana's eyes, and she squeezed his hands tightly. "You are the most remarkable man I have ever met, Quinton Quade. And yes, I want you to come with me. I want it very much." They left Shasta City within the hour, heading north and west toward the Oregon border. It would be a journey of several weeks, maybe longer if they ran into trouble or bad weather. But they had each other, and they had hope, and for now that felt like enough. The journey to Portland was arduous and beautiful in equal measure. They traveled through the wild country of Northern California, through forests of towering pines and across rivers running cold and clear from the mountains. They avoided towns when they could, camping under the stars and living off the land as much as possible to conserve their dwindling funds. During those long days of travel, Quinton and Liliana grew closer in ways that felt both inevitable and miraculous. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing their hopes and fears, their dreams and disappointments. They learned each other's rhythms, the small gestures and habits that made them individuals. And slowly, carefully, they began to fall in love. It happened in the quiet moments, like when Quinton taught Liliana how to start a fire without matches, and she laughed with delight when the kindling finally caught. Or when Liliana read aloud from a battered book of poetry she had been carrying in her bag, and Quinton found himself mesmerized by the sound of her voice shaping the words. Or when they lay under the stars at night, side by side but not quite touching, and talked about what kind of life they wanted to build. "I still want to teach," Liliana said one night, about 2 weeks into their journey. "I know it is not a practical dream, that most people think women should not be educated beyond basic reading and writing. But I believe learning is important, that it opens doors and creates possibilities. I want to help other girls see that they can be more than what society tells them they should be." "Then you should teach," Quinton said simply. "Once we get to Portland and you are settled, you should find a way to make that dream real. Just like that." Liliana asked, turning her head to look at him in the firelight. "You do not think it is foolish or impractical? I think you risked everything for freedom and survived the desert when you should have died," Quinton said, meeting her gaze. "If you can do that, you can do anything you set your mind to, and for what it is worth, I think you would be an excellent teacher." Liliana reached across the space between them and laced her fingers through his. "What about you? What do you want, Quinton? Not what you think you should want or what is practical, but what does your heart want?" It was a question no one had asked him in years, and Quinton found himself answering with an honesty that surprised him. "I want a home. Not just a place to sleep, but a real home, with people who matter and work that means something. I want to wake up in the morning and feel like I am building something instead of just passing through. And I want someone to share it with, someone who sees me and understands me and wants me around anyway." "You have that," Liliana said softly, her thumb tracing circles on the back of his hand. "Or you could if you wanted it. I see you, Quinton, I understand you, and I very much want you around." Quinton's breath caught in his throat at her words, at the sincerity shining in her eyes. He had been alone for so long, had convinced himself that he was better off that way, but now the possibility of something different, something more, was right here in front of him, and he would have been a fool to turn it away. "Liliana," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I am falling in love with you. I know it is too soon. I know we have only known each other a few weeks, but I cannot help it. You have brought something back to life in me that I thought was dead and buried." "Then we are falling together," Liliana said, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Because I love you too, Quinton Quade. I love your kindness and your strength and the way you see the best in me even when I cannot see it myself. I love that you came after me when anyone else would have kept riding. I love you, and I want to build that life with you, whatever it looks like." Quinton leaned in and kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. It was a kiss that tasted of hope and new beginnings, of two lost souls finding their way to each other against impossible odds. When they pulled apart, both were smiling through their tears. "So we are doing this." Quinton asked, his forehead resting against hers. "We are building a life together. We are doing this," Liliana confirmed. "Together." They crossed into Oregon in early September, the landscape shifting to deeper forests and cooler temperatures. The journey had taken its toll on both of them, leaving them lean and weathered, but there was a new strength in their bearing, a confidence that came from having survived and thrived together. Portland was larger and more bustling than either of them had expected, a growing city on the Willamette River full of commerce and opportunity. Liliana's cousin, Catherine, lived in a comfortable house on the outskirts of the city with her husband Thomas and their 3 young children. The reunion between Liliana and Catherine was tearful and joyous, the 2 women embracing on the front porch while Thomas and Quinton looked on with indulgent smiles. Catherine and Thomas listened to Liliana's story with growing outrage and sympathy, and they immediately offered to help in any way they could. "You will stay here as long as you need," Catherine insisted, ushering them into the house. "Both of you. We have room and you are family." Over the next few days, Quinton and Liliana settled into a new routine in Portland. Thomas helped Quinton find work at the docks, where his strength and reliability quickly made him valuable. Liliana, meanwhile, began making inquiries about teaching positions, though she quickly discovered that most schools were reluctant to hire a woman with no formal credentials and no references. "They all want proof of my education, letters of recommendation from previous employers," she told Quinton one evening as they walked along the river. "I have none of that. My education was informal, taught by my mother and then through books I read on my own. And I cannot exactly ask my father for a reference." "So we find another way," Quinton said, taking her hand in his. "Maybe you do not need a formal school. Maybe you start your own, teach children whose parents cannot afford the regular schools or who do not fit into the standard system." Liliana's eyes lit up at the suggestion. "You really think I could do that?" "I know you could," Quinton said with conviction. "You just need to believe it too." Encouraged by his faith in her, Liliana began spreading the word through Catherine's network of friends and acquaintances that she was offering tutoring and lessons to children who needed extra help or whose families could not afford the fees at the established schools. The response was better than she had dared hope, and within a month, she had a small but steady group of students meeting at Catherine's house 3 times a week. Watching her teach was a revelation to Quinton. She had a natural gift for making even the most difficult concepts accessible, and she treated each student with patience and respect, regardless of their background or ability. The children adored her, and their parents praised her methods and results. For the first time since fleeing Reading, Liliana began to truly bloom, her confidence growing as she stepped into the role she had been meant for all along. But their happiness was shadowed by the constant worry that Bernard or her father's men might still be searching for her. Every stranger who looked at them too long, every unexpected knock at the door, sent Liliana's anxiety spiraling. Quinton did his best to reassure her, but he shared her concerns. Men like Bernard Whitmore did not give up easily when they felt they had been cheated of something they believed was theirs. The confrontation they had been dreading came on a cold October afternoon. Quinton was working at the docks when one of Catherine's neighbors came running to find him, saying that 2 men had arrived at the house, asking questions about Liliana. Quinton ran the entire way back, his heart pounding with fear and fury. When he burst through the front door, he found Liliana standing in the parlor facing 2 rough-looking men he did not recognize. Catherine was there too, her face pale but determined, standing protectively near her cousin. "Quinton," Liliana said, relief flooding her voice when she saw him. These men say they have been hired by Bernard to bring me back to Reading. The lady does not want to go with you, Quinton said coldly, positioning himself between Liliana and the men. So I suggest you leave. The larger of the two men, a scarred brute with cold eyes, laughed unpleasantly. We were not hired to care what the lady wants. We were hired to bring her back, and that is what we intend to do. Now you can step aside and make this easy, or we can make it hard. Your choice, Cowboy. I am not going anywhere with you, Liliana said, her voice shaking but firm. I am not Bernard's property, and I am not going to marry him. Tell him to leave me alone. That is not how this works, the second man said, moving toward Liliana. Now come along quietly and nobody gets hurt. Quinton moved in a flash, his fist connecting with the second man's jaw before he could lay a hand on Liliana. The man went down hard, blood spurting from his mouth. The larger man lunged at Quinton with a roar, and they crashed together in a tangle of fists and fury. Quinton had learned to fight during the war and in the hard years after, and he used every dirty trick he knew to keep the bigger man off balance. They crashed through the parlor, overturning furniture and breaking glass, while Catherine screamed for help and Liliana grabbed a heavy candlestick to use as a weapon if needed. The fight ended when Thomas arrived with several neighbors, including a local constable who had been having lunch nearby. The two hired men were subdued and arrested for assault and attempted kidnapping, and the constable took detailed statements from everyone present. These men have no legal authority to take you anywhere, the constable told Liliana. And based on what you have told me about the circumstances of your flight from California, you have every right to refuse to return. I will make sure they are prosecuted, and I will send word back to Reading that you are under the protection of the law here in Portland. With any luck, that will be enough to discourage further attempts. Relief and delayed shock hit Liliana all at once, and she collapsed into Quinton's arms, shaking with tears. He held her close, murmuring reassurances while his own heart gradually slowed from its frantic pace. It is over, he told her. You are safe. I will not let anyone take you away. That evening, after the mess was cleaned up and the children were in bed, Quinton and Liliana sat together on the porch watching the sun set over the city. The events of the day had shaken them both, but they had also clarified something important. I almost lost you today, Quinton said quietly, his arm around Liliana's shoulders. When I saw those men in the house, when I thought they might take you away, I realized that I cannot imagine my life without you anymore. Somewhere between finding your letter and fighting for you today, you became everything to me. You are everything to me too, Liliana said, turning to face him. You saved my life in more ways than one. You gave me freedom, hope, a future. You gave me love when I thought I would never find it. Quinton Quade, I want to spend the rest of my life with you, building the dreams we talked about under the stars. Quinton reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object that glinted in the fading light. It was the silver locket from Liliana's satchel, the one he had found with her letter in the desert. He had been carrying it all this time, meaning to give it back to her when the moment was right. This was your mother's, was it not? He asked, placing it in her hand. Liliana opened the locket with trembling fingers, revealing two tiny portraits inside. One was a young woman who looked remarkably like Liliana, and the other was a man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. My parents, she confirmed, tears spilling down her cheeks. I thought I had lost this in the desert. You kept it safe all this time. I wanted to give it back to you when we had built the life you were fighting for, Quinton said, when you were truly free and truly happy. And Liliana, I know I do not have much to offer. I am just a dock worker with no family name and no fortune. But I love you with everything I am, and I want to marry you if you will have me. I want to build a home with you, raise a family with you, grow old with you. I want all of it, all the messy, beautiful, complicated parts of building a life together. Yes, Liliana said through her tears, throwing her arms around his neck. Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. I do not care about fortune or family names. I care about you, about the man who risked everything to save a stranger in the desert. I care about the life we are going to build together. They were married in November in a small ceremony at Catherine and Thomas's house, with a handful of friends and Liliana's students in attendance. It was not a grand affair, but it was perfect in its simplicity and sincerity. Liliana wore a simple dress that Catherine had helped her make, and Quinton wore the best clothes he owned, freshly cleaned and pressed for the occasion. When they exchanged their vows, there was not a dry eye in the room. They promised to love and honor each other, to support each other's dreams, to face whatever challenges life brought them together. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Quinton kissed his bride with a tenderness that spoke of all the hope and love and possibility their future held. In the months that followed, Quinton and Liliana worked tirelessly to build the life they had dreamed of. With the money Quinton saved from his dock work and a small loan from Thomas, they were able to rent a modest house on the edge of Portland that was big enough to serve as both their home and Liliana's school. The school grew beyond anything Liliana had imagined, as word spread about the young teacher who welcomed all students regardless of their ability to pay. She taught reading and writing, mathematics and history, but more than that, she taught her students to think for themselves, to question and explore and dream big. Many of her students were girls from poor families who would never have had access to education otherwise, and Liliana took special pride in showing them that learning could open doors they never knew existed. Quinton, meanwhile, worked his way up from the docks to a position managing shipments and logistics for one of the larger trading companies in Portland. It was steady work that used both his physical strength and his sharp mind, and it paid well enough to support their growing household. Their first child, a son they named Samuel after Quinton's father, was born in the summer of 1880, 2 years after that fateful day when Quinton had found Liliana's letter in the desert. Holding his son for the first time, Quinton was overcome with gratitude for the strange path that had led him to this moment. If he had not stopped to investigate what his horse had stumbled over, if he had not read that letter, if he had not chosen to go after a woman he had never met, none of this would exist. What are you thinking about? Liliana asked from the bed, exhausted but radiant as she watched her husband cradle their newborn son. I am thinking about how one decision changed everything, Quinton said, carefully settling the baby in Liliana's arms. How choosing to help a stranger in the desert led me here to you, to this perfect little family we have built. It was not chance, Liliana said, her eyes full of love as she looked between her husband and son. It was meant to be. You were meant to find that letter. We were meant to find each other. Their daughter Anna arrived 2 years later, followed by another son, Joseph, 2 years after that. The house was full of noise and laughter and love, everything Quinton had thought lost to him forever before he met Liliana. The years passed in a blur of joy and hard work and small triumphs. Liliana's school became an institution in Portland, eventually moving to a larger building as enrollment grew beyond what their house could accommodate. She hired other teachers to help her, women who shared her passion for education and her belief that every child deserved the chance to learn. Quinton continued to advance in his career, eventually becoming a partner in the trading company and earning a comfortable living that allowed them to save for their children's futures. But he never forgot where he had come from, and he made a point of hiring men who reminded him of himself, drifters and veterans who just needed someone to take a chance on them. News from California was sparse, but they eventually learned through Catherine's network that Bernard Whitmore had died in a riding accident a few years after Liliana's flight. Her father, Abraham, lived on for several more years but made no further attempts to contact her or bring her home. When he died in 1885, he left his entire estate to the church, effectively cutting Liliana out completely. "Does it hurt?" Quinton asked when Liliana received the news. "Knowing he never forgave you for leaving." "Not anymore," Liliana said honestly. "He stopped being my father the moment he tried to sell me to a cruel man for his own benefit. The family I have now, the one we built together, that is what matters. That is what is real." On a warm summer evening in 1895, Quinton and Liliana sat on the porch of the home they had owned for years now, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Samuel had married a lovely woman named Grace and given them 2 grandchildren, with a third on the way. Anna was engaged to a young lawyer who adored her, and Joseph was following in his father's footsteps at the trading company. The school had grown beyond anything Liliana had imagined in those early days. Now, a respected institution that had educated hundreds of children over the years. Many of her former students had gone on to do remarkable things, and several had become teachers themselves, spreading her philosophy of inclusive, thoughtful education to other communities. "You ever think about that day in the desert?" Liliana asked, leaning against her husband's shoulder. "The day you found my letter?" "Every day," Quinton admitted, taking her hand in his. "That letter changed my heart forever, just like the title of this story would suggest if it had one. It woke me up from a life I was just sleepwalking through and showed me what was possible when you care enough to take a risk." "I still have it, you know," Liliana said. "The letter. I keep it in my mother's locket, folded up small. A reminder of how far we have come, how much we have built from that moment of desperation and hope." "Read it to me," Quinton requested. "I want to hear the words that started everything." Liliana retrieved the locket from around her neck and carefully unfolded the fragile, yellowed paper. In the golden light of the setting sun, she read aloud the words she had written so long ago in the desert, when she had been alone and terrified and convinced she was going to die. Her voice cracked with emotion as she reached the end. "Love fiercely, love truly, and never let go of those who matter most." "We did that," Quinton said softly when she finished. "We loved fiercely. We built a life that mattered, and we never let go of each other, not once in all these years." "Not once," Liliana agreed, folding the letter carefully and placing it back in the locket. "And I would not change a single moment of it, not the fear or the hardship or the uncertainty. It all led us here, to this beautiful life we have created together." As the sun dipped below the horizon, and the children called their grandchildren in for dinner, Quinton pulled Liliana close and kissed her forehead. They had been married for 17 years, together for slightly longer, and he loved her more deeply than he had thought possible when they had exchanged vows in Catherine's parlor all those years ago. Their life together had not always been easy. There had been lean years when money was tight, frightening moments when one of the children was sick, disagreements and frustrations that tested their patience. But through it all, they had held fast to each other and to the promise they had made under the stars during their journey to Portland. To face whatever came together, with love and courage and unwavering faith in each other. The years continued to unfold with grace and gratitude. In 1900, as the new century dawned, Quinton and Liliana celebrated their silver anniversary with a party attended by what seemed like half of Portland. Students past and present came to honor the woman who had changed their lives, and business associates and friends came to celebrate the man who had built a reputation for integrity and fairness. During the celebration, Samuel stood to make a toast. He was 35 now, a successful businessman in his own right with a growing family and a bright future. But as he looked at his parents, his eyes were full of the same wonder and love he had shown as a child. "Many of you know the story of how my parents met," he began, and the room fell quiet. "How my father found a letter in the desert written by a desperate woman seeking freedom, and how he chose to search for her instead of continuing on his way. But what you may not know is how that single decision, that moment of compassion and courage, created ripples that spread far beyond just their lives. My mother's school has educated hundreds of children who would never have had that opportunity otherwise. My father's business has provided jobs and stability to countless families. Their marriage has been a model of partnership and mutual respect that influenced everyone who knows them. And their children and grandchildren carry forward the values they embodied: courage, compassion, the belief that love is worth fighting for. So when we raise our glasses to them tonight, we are not just celebrating a marriage, though theirs is certainly worth celebrating. We are honoring the choice to act with kindness, to take a risk on behalf of a stranger, to believe that love can transform lives. Mom, Dad, thank you for showing us what it means to live with purpose and passion. Thank you for building a life that matters." There was not a dry eye in the room as everyone raised their glasses, and Quinton felt Liliana's hand tighten around his. They had built something remarkable together, not through grand gestures or heroic deeds, but through thousands of small choices to love each other, to support each other's dreams, to show up every day and do the work of building a life worth living. As they grew older, they made a practice of returning every summer to the desert where their story had begun. It was a long journey from Portland, but they felt it was important to revisit the place where everything had changed. They would stand on the spot where Quinton had found Liliana collapsed beneath that rocky outcropping, and they would marvel at how far they had come. "I was so certain I was going to die here," Liliana said during one such visit when they were both in their 60s. "I had given up hope. If you had arrived even a few hours later, you would have found only my body." "But I did not arrive too late," Quinton said, pulling her close despite the heat. "I arrived exactly when I was meant to, and you survived because you are the strongest person I have ever known. You fought for your life, you fought for your freedom, and you won." "We won," Liliana corrected gently. "Neither of us could have built this life alone. It took both of us, working together, believing in each other even when things were hard." On their 40th wedding anniversary in 1915, their children and grandchildren organized a massive celebration that included a formal ceremony renewing their vows. Quinton was 73 now, his hair silver and his hands gnarled from years of hard work. Liliana was 70, her face lined with the marks of a life well lived, her hair gone white as snow. But when they stood before each other and repeated the vows they had first spoken in Catherine's parlor 4 decades earlier, they were the same two people who had found each other in the desert. Fierce, determined, full of love and hope for the future. "I, Quinton Quade, take you, Liliana Morrison Quade, to be my wife for whatever time we have remaining," Quinton said, his voice still strong despite his age. "You have been my partner, my love, my purpose for 40 years, and I thank God every day that I found your letter in that desert. You changed my heart forever, and I have loved you every day since. I, Liliana Morrison Quade, take you, Quinton Quade, to be my husband until death and beyond," Liliana said through happy tears. "You saved my life, and then you gave me a life worth living. You believed in my dreams and helped me make them real. You have been my rock, my companion, my greatest love. Everything good in my life started the day you found me in the desert, and I will love you for all eternity." When they kissed, their grandchildren whooped and hollered, and their children wept openly. It was a kiss that held 40 years of shared memories, of joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle, all bound together by a love that had only deepened with time. Quinton passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1919, at the age of 77. He died as he had lived, with Liliana's hand in his, surrounded by family and love. His last words were to tell his wife that finding her letter had been the greatest blessing of his life, and that he would wait for her on the other side. Liliana grieved deeply, but not hopelessly. She had loved Quinton with her whole heart, but she also knew that he would want her to continue living, to continue making a difference in the world they had built together. So she poured herself into the school, into her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, into preserving the legacy they had created. She lived for another 6 years, remaining active and engaged right up until the end. She died in the spring of 1925 at the age of 80, surrounded by 3 generations of the family she and Quinton had created. Her final words were about the letter, about that moment of desperate hope that had changed everything. "Never give up on love," she told her gathered family. "Never stop fighting for the life you want. Your grandfather taught me that when he came after me in the desert, and we spent 40 beautiful years proving it true. Love fiercely, love truly, and never let go of those who matter most." At her funeral, which was attended by hundreds of former students, family members, and friends, Samuel read aloud from his mother's letter, the one that had started everything. The fragile paper had been carefully preserved all these years, a sacred relic of the moment when 2 lost souls found their way to each other. The letter was eventually donated to the Portland Historical Society, where it was displayed alongside photographs of Quinton and Liliana, documentation of the school Liliana had founded, and records of the business Quinton had helped build. It became a symbol of hope and courage, a reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with a single act of kindness, a willingness to help a stranger in need. Years later, one of Liliana's great-granddaughters, who had become a writer, penned a book about her great-grandparents' love story. She titled it The Desert Letter, and it became a beloved tale passed down through generations, inspiring others to act with courage and compassion, to take risks for love, to believe that one person's choice could change everything. The school Liliana founded continued to operate well into the 20th century, adapting and evolving but always maintaining her core principle that every child deserved access to quality education, regardless of their circumstances. A scholarship fund was established in her name, helping hundreds of students pursue their dreams of higher education. The house where Quinton and Liliana had raised their family became a historical landmark, preserved as an example of late 19th century Portland architecture, and as a monument to a love story that had captured the city's imagination. Visitors could walk through the rooms where their children had played, see the porch where they had sat together watching the sunset, stand in the classroom where Liliana had taught generations of students. But perhaps the greatest legacy of Quinton and Liliana's love was not any building or institution, but the example they set for how to live a life of purpose and passion. They taught their children and grandchildren that love is a choice you make every day, that building a life together requires work and commitment and unwavering faith in each other. They showed that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it, that kindness to strangers can change the world, that it is never too late to start over and build the life you dream of. Samuel carried his parents' lessons into his own long and happy marriage, passing them on to his children. Anna became a teacher like her mother, dedicating her life to education and social justice. Joseph built a business empire based on the principles of fairness and integrity his father had modeled. And their children and grandchildren spread out across the country, carrying with them the story of the cowboy who found a letter in the desert and the woman whose desperate hope changed both their lives forever. In the end, that is what love does. It transforms. It redeems. It gives meaning to the mundane and purpose to the purposeless. Quinton had been a drifter, a man running from his past with no vision for his future. Liliana had been a trapped woman with dreams bigger than the prison her life had become. Together, they became something neither could have achieved alone: partners, lovers, builders of a legacy that would outlive them by generations. The letter that brought them together became more than just a cry for help from a desperate woman. It became a symbol of hope, a reminder that reaching out in our darkest moments can lead to unexpected salvation. It became a testament to the power of one person's choice to act with kindness and courage. And it became the foundation of a love story that proved true love is worth fighting for, worth risking everything to find and keep. Decades after both Quinton and Liliana had passed, their descendants still gathered every summer at the site in the desert where Quinton had found Liliana collapsed beneath that rocky outcropping. They would tell the story to the youngest generation, keeping the memory alive, honoring the courage and love that had made their family possible. And sometimes, if the light was just right and the desert wind whispered through the scrub brush just so, you could almost feel their presence there. Two souls who had found each other against all odds, whose love had burned bright enough to light the way for everyone who came after them. That is the power of love. That is the legacy of choosing courage over fear, compassion over indifference, hope over despair. That is what happens when a lonely cowboy finds a letter in the desert and decides that one woman's desperate cry for help matters more than his own convenience or safety. What that letter said changed Quinton's heart forever. But more than that, it changed the trajectory of two lives, the future of countless students, the shape of a family that would span generations. All because one man chose to care, chose to act, chose to believe that love was possible even in the harshest, most unforgiving landscape imaginable. And in the end, that choice made all the difference.